The old Winterbourne mansion stood like a giant castle at the edge of the city. For weeks, workers had been coming and going, preparing for the biggest charity event of the year. Tonight wasn't just any party. It was the kind of event where millionaires wore their most expensive jewelry and politicians smiled for cameras. Isabella Rodriguez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stepped off the bus. She was running 5 minutes late, and that made her nervous. At 24 years old, she'd learned that being late meant losing opportunities, and she couldn't afford that. Not with 2 younger siblings depending on her. The catering agency had called her 3 days ago. They needed extra servers for a fancy event. The pay was good, almost double her usual rate at the downtown diner where she worked most nights. Isabella had said yes immediately, even though it meant skipping her Saturday shift at the coffee shop. Walking up the long driveway, she clutched her small backpack tighter. Inside was her black uniform, freshly washed and ironed at midnight after her last shift. Her shoes were old, the leather cracked near the toes, but she'd polished them until they almost looked new. Nobody would notice anyway. Rich people rarely looked down at the help. The service entrance was busy with activity. Chefs shouted orders in the kitchen. Florists arranged massive bouquets of roses that probably cost more than Isabella's monthly rent. She found the supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Chen, who barely glanced at her before pointing toward the changing room. After putting on her uniform, Isabella made her way through the narrow service hallways. These passages were hidden behind elegant walls, allowing staff to move around without disturbing the guests. It was like 2 different worlds existing in the same building. On one side, luxury and laughter. On the other, rushing feet and whispered instructions. She took a wrong turn and suddenly found herself at a side entrance to the main ballroom. The door was slightly open, and what she saw made her stop breathing. The ballroom was like something from a fairy tale. 3 massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each one dripping with hundreds of crystals that caught the afternoon light and scattered it into tiny rainbows. The floor was made of white and gold marble, polished so perfectly that it reflected everything like a mirror. Tall windows lined one wall, draped with burgundy velvet curtains that must have cost a fortune. But what really caught Isabella's attention was the piano. Right in the center of the room, on a small raised platform, sat a grand piano. Not just any piano, but a Steinway. Its black surface so shiny she could probably see her reflection from across the room. The lid was propped open, revealing the strings inside, ready to sing. Isabella's fingers began to tingle. It was an old familiar feeling, one she'd tried to forget for 6 long years. Almost without thinking, her right hand lifted, fingers moving in the air as if playing invisible keys. She could almost hear the music in her head, feel the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. She'd been 12 when she first touched a real piano. Her middle school music teacher, Mr. Patterson, had noticed her humming complex melodies and tapping rhythms on her desk. He'd stayed late one afternoon to teach her the basics. Within months, Isabella was playing pieces that students twice her age struggled with. By 16, she'd earned a full scholarship to the prestigious Riverside Conservatory. Her parents had cried with joy. Their daughter, the first in their family to show such talent, was going to be a real musician. Maybe she'd perform in concert halls. Maybe she'd teach. Maybe she'd compose music that people would play for generations. Then came the accident. Isabella closed her eyes, pushing away the memory of that phone call. The drunk driver who ran the red light. Her father killed instantly. Her mother surviving but paralyzed, needing round-the-clock care. And suddenly, at 17, Isabella became the head of the household, responsible for her mother and 2 younger siblings, Rico, who was 14, and little Maya, who was only 9. The scholarship didn't matter anymore. The conservatory felt like a dream from someone else's life. She'd left after just 1 semester, finding work wherever she could, waitressing, cleaning houses, working retail during holidays. Anything to pay the bills, afford her mother's medications, keep food on the table. The piano became a memory she kept locked away, too painful to touch. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." Isabella jumped, her heart racing. Another server, an older man she didn't know, was glaring at her from down the hallway. "Sorry, I got lost," she said quickly, letting the door close and hurrying back toward the service area. Mrs. Chen was waiting with a tray. "You'll be serving champagne during the cocktail hour. Keep your tray balanced. Don't make eye contact with the guests unless they speak to you first, and for heaven's sake, don't spill anything. These people don't forgive mistakes. Isabella nodded, taking the tray. It was heavy, loaded with delicate crystal glasses filled with golden champagne. Each glass probably cost more than she made in a day. As she practiced balancing the tray, one of the other servers, a kind woman named Linda who looked about 50, smiled at her. First time at one of these fancy events? That obvious? Isabella asked. Don't worry, honey. Just remember you're invisible to them. They don't see us as real people. Makes the job easier, actually. Less pressure. Isabella wasn't sure if that was comforting or depressing. The cocktail hour would start in 30 minutes. Guests would begin arriving soon, stepping out of luxury cars and limousines dripping with diamonds and designer labels. They'd drink expensive champagne, eat tiny portions of food arranged like art, and talk about their vacation homes and stock portfolios. And Isabella would weave between them like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates, present but unseen. She took a deep breath and lifted her tray, practicing the smooth gliding walk Mrs. Chen had demonstrated. In the distance, she could hear musicians tuning their instruments. A violin's high note, the low rumble of a cello, and somewhere beyond those walls in that beautiful ballroom, the Steinway piano waited silently. Isabella shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Tonight she wasn't a musician. She wasn't someone with dreams and talents. She was a server, nothing more. And that was fine. That was reality. The piano was just an object in a room. It had nothing to do with her anymore. But as she headed toward the main floor, ready to work, her fingers still tingled with phantom melodies, and somewhere deep in her chest, something that had been sleeping for 6 years stirred slightly, like a person waking from a long, dark dream. The first limousine arrived exactly at 6 o'clock. Through the service entrance windows, Isabella watched as a couple stepped out, the woman's dress sparkling under the setting sun. More cars followed, a parade of wealth rolling up the curved driveway. Mrs. Chen lined up the servers, inspecting each one like a military commander. She straightened one girl's collar, frowned at another's posture, and reminded everyone for the third time about the importance of keeping their trays level. Remember, she said sharply, you represent our agency. One mistake, one spill, one wrong word, and we lose this contract. The Winterbourne family has used our services for 15 years. Don't be the reason that ends tonight. Isabella's hands felt sweaty. She wiped them on her uniform pants when Mrs. Chen wasn't looking. The cocktail hour began, and Isabella entered the grand hallway where guests mingled before entering the ballroom. The noise hit her first. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses. Everyone seemed to know each other, or at least pretended to. Women air-kissed without touching their makeup. Men shook hands while glancing around to see who else was there. Isabella moved through the crowd offering champagne. Most people took a glass without even looking at her, exactly as Linda had predicted. She was invisible, just a moving tray, but staying invisible required skill. She learned quickly to read the crowd, to anticipate when someone might turn suddenly, to slide past conversations without interrupting. It was like a dance, and she'd always been good at reading rhythms. She was refilling her tray at the service bar when she first heard his name. Victor Ashford is performing tonight, a woman said excitedly to her companion. I heard he just returned from playing in Vienna. Absolutely magnificent, apparently. Oh, I saw him last spring at the Kennedy Center. Another voice joined in. His Chopin is divine, and so handsome too. Isabella had heard of Victor Ashford. Everyone in the classical music world knew the name. He'd been a child prodigy, performing at Carnegie Hall before he turned 15. Now at 32, he was considered one of the finest pianists in the country. Magazines featured him. Concert halls sold out within hours of announcing his performances. She'd watched one of his performances on YouTube years ago, back when she still allowed herself to watch piano videos. He was technically perfect, that was undeniable. Every note precise, every tempo exact. But something had felt missing to her, though she couldn't quite name what. At 7:15, the hallway suddenly shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the entrance. Victor Ashford had arrived. He stood in the doorway for just a moment, letting people notice him. He was tall, with dark hair styled perfectly, wearing a tuxedo that looked like it had been sewn onto his body. His shoes shined like mirrors. Even his smile seemed practiced, charming but not quite reaching his eyes. Two women immediately rushed over to greet him. He kissed their hands like some character from an old movie. More people gravitated toward him, drawn like moths to a flame. Isabella watched from her position near the wall. She'd seen this before, this kind of magnetic confidence that certain people carried. They didn't just enter rooms, they owned them. Mrs. Chen appeared beside her, whispering urgently, "Stop staring and keep moving. Table 7 needs fresh glasses." Isabella nodded and headed toward the ballroom, where some guests had already begun to seat themselves at the round tables set up for dinner. The piano sat waiting on its platform, lights positioned to highlight it perfectly. She was collecting empty glasses from a table when it happened. The ballroom had 3 entrances. Isabella was near the service entrance, a subtle door hidden behind a decorative screen. She'd just loaded her tray with used glasses when Victor Ashford came through the main entrance, accompanied by a tall blonde woman in a dress that probably cost more than Isabella's car. They were walking fast, deep in conversation, not really paying attention to their surroundings. Isabella stepped back to give them space, but her foot caught on the thick carpet edge. She stumbled slightly and the tray tipped forward. One champagne glass slid toward the edge. Isabella's reflexes kicked in. She shifted her weight, twisted her wrist, and caught the tray before anything fell. The glass wobbled but stayed upright. Not a single drop spilled, but Victor had noticed the movement. He stopped and turned, his expression already annoyed before he even saw what happened. "Watch yourself, waitress," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "These glasses cost more than your monthly salary. Maybe more than your entire year." The blonde woman, who Isabella later learned was named Veronica, laughed like it was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Victor, you're terrible. But honestly, do they even train these people properly?" Isabella felt her cheeks burning. Several guests at nearby tables had turned to look. She wanted to say something, to point out that she hadn't actually dropped anything, that she'd recovered perfectly. But Mrs. Chen's warning echoed in her head. "Don't talk back. Don't make scenes. Don't lose us this contract. I apologize, sir," she said quietly, keeping her eyes down. "It won't happen again." Victor had already lost interest. He was turning away, dismissing her like she was a piece of furniture. But Veronica wasn't done. "Tell me, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Do you even know what you're serving? This is vintage champagne, not the cheap stuff you probably drink at your little parties." Someone at a nearby table snickered. Isabella's hands were shaking now, but she kept her voice steady. "Excuse me," she said, and walked away toward the service entrance, head high, refusing to run even though everything in her wanted to. In the service hallway, she set down her tray and leaned against the cool wall, taking deep breaths. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. She'd dealt with worse than some arrogant pianist and his mean girlfriend. Linda appeared beside her, offering a small bottle of water. "Don't let them get to you, honey. That Victor guy is known for being difficult. Last year's event, he made one of our servers cry because his water wasn't cold enough." "I'm fine," Isabella said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You handled it well. Kept your cool. That's what matters," Linda patted her shoulder. "Now come on, they're about to serve the appetizers." Back in the ballroom, the guests had settled at their tables. Isabella returned to work, moving between tables with plates of food arranged like tiny works of art. She avoided the section where Victor sat, surrounded by admirers hanging on his every word. She could hear his voice carrying across the room. He was telling a story about performing for some royal family in Europe, making it sound both impressive and exhausting, like he was doing everyone a favor by sharing his talent. Isabella focused on her work, but she couldn't help glancing occasionally at the piano. Victor would play soon. Despite everything, part of her was curious. She wanted to hear what made him so famous, what earned him all this attention. During a brief break, she stood in the shadows near the service door, watching Victor schmooze with the crowd. He worked the room expertly, knowing exactly who to talk to, how long to spend with each person, when to flash that practiced smile. Another server, a young guy named Tommy, came to stand beside her. "That's the guy who made you stumble earlier, right?" "What a jerk." "It's fine," Isabella said. "Not worth thinking about." "He's not even that good," Tommy continued. "My cousin took piano lessons for years. She said technically perfect doesn't mean emotionally moving. Something like that." Basically, he plays all the right notes, but it feels empty. Isabella smiled slightly. She'd thought the exact same thing when she'd watched that YouTube video years ago. Mrs. Winterbourne, the elderly hostess, stood and clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice warm and genuine. "Your generous donations will help provide music education to underprivileged children across our city. And now, to inspire your generosity even further, please welcome our featured performer, the incomparable Victor Ashford." The room erupted in applause. Victor stood, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and walked to the piano like a king approaching his throne. He sat, adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers, and looked out at the audience with that same practiced smile. Isabella watched from the shadows, her heart beating faster. Despite everything, despite his rudeness and arrogance, she couldn't help but want to hear him play. Music was music, after all. And she'd been hungry to hear real piano music live and in person for so very long. Victor sat at the piano like he'd been born there. His posture was perfect. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands hovering over the keys with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing attention on him and the beautiful Steinway. The room fell completely silent. Even the server stopped moving, standing still against the walls as they'd been instructed. Then Victor began to play. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, though arranged for solo piano. It was a bold choice, technically demanding, full of sweeping melodies and dramatic passages. The kind of piece that showed off a pianist's skill, and Victor's skill was undeniable. His fingers flew across the keys with incredible speed. Not a single note was missed. Not a single timing was off. Every crescendo built perfectly. Every soft passage whispered exactly as it should. He made it look effortless, like the piano was simply an extension of his own body. The audience was impressed. Isabella could see it in their faces. Women leaned forward in their seats. Men nodded appreciatively. This was what they'd come for, what they'd paid to see. But Isabella, standing in the shadows near the service entrance, felt something strange, something she couldn't quite name. Yes, the playing was perfect, technically flawless. If this were a competition, Victor would score perfect marks for accuracy, for speed, for precision. But something was missing, something essential. It was like looking at a perfect photograph of a sunset instead of watching the real thing. All the colors were there, all the shapes were correct, but the warmth was gone. The feeling was absent. Victor played the notes, but he wasn't playing the music. Isabella found herself closing her eyes, trying to feel the emotion that Rachmaninoff had poured into this piece. The composer had written it after years of depression, after finally finding hope again. Every note was supposed to be filled with struggle and triumph, darkness and light, but what she heard was just notes. Beautiful notes, perfectly executed notes, but notes nonetheless. When Victor reached the final dramatic passage, his hands crashed down on the keys with impressive force. The sound filled the ballroom, echoing off the high ceiling. He held the last note, letting it fade slowly, then lifted his hands in a graceful finishing gesture. The audience exploded into applause. People stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Victor stood and bowed, first to the center of the audience, then to each side of the room. His smile was wide, satisfied. This was what he expected, what he'd earned. Isabella clapped too, because it would be rude not to. The playing had been impressive, after all. But her heart felt heavy in a way she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Chen signaled to the servers, and they sprang back into action. Dinner service was about to begin. For the next hour, Isabella moved between tables, serving plates of food that looked too pretty to eat. Seared fish with tiny vegetables arranged like flowers. Perfectly cooked beef with sauce drizzled in artistic patterns. Desserts that looked like small sculptures. All around her, people talked about Victor's performance. "Absolutely magnificent," one woman said to her dinner companion. "Did you see his technique in that fast section?" "Incredible," a man added. "I heard he might tour Japan next year. I simply must get tickets." Victor himself moved from table to table during dinner, accepting compliments with practiced humility. "Oh, you're too kind," he'd say, while his eyes said, "Yes, I know I'm brilliant." When he reached the table where Mrs. Winterbourne sat with several major donors, he lingered longer. This was business, after all. These were the people who could hire him for future events. who could donate to causes he supported, who could keep his name in the right circles. Isabella was clearing plates from a nearby table when she overheard part of their conversation. "Victor, darling, that was extraordinary," Mrs. Winterbourne said. "You've outdone yourself." "The pleasure was mine, Eleanor," Victor replied smoothly. "Supporting music education is close to my heart. After all, without proper training, natural talent goes nowhere." Speaking of which, one of the donors, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit, said, "I heard enrollment is down at the conservatory. These young people today, they don't appreciate classical music like they should." "They lack discipline," Victor agreed. "Real musicianship requires dedication, proper breeding, and years of focused study. It's not something just anyone can do." Isabella felt her jaw tighten. She knew what he really meant. People like her from working-class families weren't supposed to understand real music. They weren't refined enough, educated enough, wealthy enough. She moved away before she heard more, before she said something that would get her fired. Linda caught up with her near the kitchen entrance. "You okay? You look upset." "I'm fine," Isabella lied. "Just tired." "Well, good news. We're almost done with dinner service. Just dessert left, then coffee, and we can start cleanup." "My feet are killing me." Isabella managed to smile. "Just another hour or two. Then she could go home. Take off these uncomfortable shoes and forget all about Victor Ashford and his perfect, empty piano playing." But as she returned to the ballroom, she couldn't help glancing at the piano. It sat there silently now, lid still open, waiting. In the right light, she could almost see the keys gleaming. Her fingers tingled again, that old familiar feeling. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to make it stop. The dessert service went smoothly. Tiny plates with elaborate sweets that probably took hours to create. Isabella focused on not tripping, not spilling, not giving Victor another opportunity to humiliate her. Mrs. Winterbourne stood again, thanking everyone for their generosity and announcing the total amount raised for the music education program. The number was staggering, more money than Isabella would make in 5 years. "And now," Mrs. Winterbourne continued, "before we continue with coffee and dancing, I believe Victor has agreed to play one more short piece for us."
"Is that right, Victor?"
Victor stood, soaking up the attention. "Of course, it would be my honor." But just as he started toward the piano, Mrs. Winterbourne's assistant rushed over and whispered something urgent in her ear. The elderly woman's face fell. "Oh dear," she said aloud. "It seems our scheduled singer for the second half has called in ill. Food poisoning, apparently." "How unfortunate," the assistant whispered more urgently. Mrs. Winterbourne looked worried now. "We have a 30-minute gap in the program. The band isn't scheduled to start until 9:30. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Gaps in fancy events were social disasters. People didn't know what to do with unplanned time. Victor, ever the professional, stepped forward. "I could play something longer, Eleanor. Perhaps another concerto?" But Mrs. Winterbourne shook her head slightly. "You've already been so generous with your time, Victor. And you have that early flight tomorrow for your Chicago performance." She turned to her assistant. "Find something, anything, music from the sound system, perhaps." The assistant hurried away, looking panicked. Linda, standing next to Isabella near the kitchen entrance, had overheard everything. She turned to Isabella with an odd expression on her face. "No," Isabella said immediately, somehow knowing what Linda was thinking. "Absolutely not. Mrs. Chen told me you used to study music," Linda said quietly. "She saw it on your resume once. That was years ago. I haven't played in front of people since I was 17. But you can still play, right?" "Linda, no. Look at this place. Look at these people. They just heard Victor Ashford, one of the most famous pianists in the country. I can't just walk up there and—" "Mrs. Winterbourne needs help," Linda interrupted. "We're part of the service team. Helping is literally our job." Isabella's heart was pounding. The idea was insane. These people would laugh her off the stage. Victor would probably say something cruel. She'd embarrass herself, embarrass the catering company, and lose any chance of being hired for events like this again. But Linda was already walking toward Mrs. Winterbourne. "No, no," Isabella whispered, but it was too late. She watched as Linda spoke quietly to Mrs. Winterbourne. The elderly woman's eyes widened, then searched the room until they found Isabella. Mrs. Winterbourne excused herself from her table and walked directly toward her. Isabella wanted to disappear, to run, to hide in the kitchen and pretend this wasn't happening. Mrs. Winterbourne reached her and smiled kindly. My dear, Linda tells me you have musical training. It was a long time ago, ma'am. I'm really not. Could you play? Just one piece? Something simple? I'm in quite a bind here. Isabella's mouth was dry. Mrs. Winterbourne, I haven't performed in 6 years. And these people just heard Victor Ashford. I'm not at that level. I'm not asking for perfection, dear. I'm asking for help. The elderly woman's eyes were kind but desperate. Please? Isabella looked past her at the ballroom, at the wealthy guests in their expensive clothes, at Victor, who was watching this interaction with amused curiosity, at the piano, still and silent, waiting. Every logical part of her brain screamed to say no. But somewhere deeper, in a place she'd tried to bury, something else stirred. That old dream. That old love. That old hunger to touch those keys just one more time. Okay, Isabella heard herself say. Okay, I'll try. Mrs. Winterbourne's face lit up with relief. Oh, thank you, dear. Thank you so much. She squeezed Isabella's hand warmly before hurrying back to make the announcement. Isabella stood frozen, the reality of what she'd just agreed to crashing over her like a wave. Her hands were shaking. Her heart felt like it might burst out of her chest. Linda appeared beside her. You've got this. I don't got this, Isabella whispered. What was I thinking? You were thinking about helping someone who needed help. That's who you are, Linda smiled. Now breathe, and remember they're just people. Rich people, yeah, but still just people. Mrs. Chen materialized out of nowhere, looking confused and slightly annoyed. Rodriguez, what's going on? Mrs. Winterbourne's assistant just told me you're performing. Yes, ma'am. There was an emergency and I offered to help fill the gap in the program. Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. Can you actually play? Or are you about to embarrass my company? I can play, Isabella said with more confidence than she felt. I studied at Riverside Conservatory for a semester. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. Riverside? That's not a small school. She studied Isabella for a moment, then nodded. All right. Don't make me regret trusting you. And for heaven's sake, take off that apron. Isabella's fingers fumbled with the apron ties. They seemed impossibly tangled, like her nerves had traveled to her hands. Finally, she got it off and handed it to Linda. Underneath, her simple black uniform dress suddenly felt too plain, too cheap. Everyone else in that ballroom was wearing designer clothes. She was wearing polyester from a catering supply store. Hey, Linda said firmly, reading her thoughts. Stop it, you're a musician about to play. That's all that matters. Mrs. Winterbourne was standing at the microphone now. The room quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unexpected treat this evening. Due to our scheduled performer's unfortunate illness, we're delighted to have one of tonight's service staff step in to fill the gap. Isabella Rodriguez is a trained musician, and she's graciously offered to play for us. Please join me in welcoming her. The applause was polite but confused. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A server? Playing after Victor Ashford? This was highly unusual, possibly inappropriate. Isabella could see Victor near his table, leaning back in his chair with an amused smirk. He said something to Veronica, who giggled behind her hand. Several other guests were whispering, some looking curious, others looking skeptical. The walk from the service entrance to the piano felt impossibly long. Every step echoed in Isabella's head. She was aware of every eye on her, judging her clothes, her worn shoes, her working-class hands. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered a little too loudly. This should be interesting. Victor's voice carried clearly across the room. Well, this is certainly unconventional. Isabella reached the piano and stood there for a moment staring at it. The Steinway looked even more beautiful up close. The wood was flawless, the keys perfectly aligned. She could see her reflection in the polished surface, distorted and small. She sat down on the bench and suddenly everything felt wrong. The height was off. Victor was taller than her, and he'd adjusted it for his comfort. Her feet barely touched the pedals. With shaking hands, she reached under the bench for the adjustment lever. The mechanism was stiff, and for a horrible moment she thought it was stuck. Then it gave way and she lowered the bench several inches. The audience waited. The silence felt heavy, judgmental. Isabella adjusted her posture, the muscle memory coming back even after all these years. Back straight but not rigid, shoulders relaxed, wrists level with the keys. Her old teacher's voice echoed in her head. Your body is part of the instrument. Tension travels from your muscles into the music. She placed her hands on the keys, and the coolness of the ivory shocked her. How long had it been since she'd touched a real piano? Not a keyboard, not a digital substitute, but a real, living, breathing piano? The last time was in her final week at the conservatory 6 years ago. Before the phone call, before everything changed, her hands were trembling. She tried to still them, but they wouldn't obey. What was she thinking? She couldn't do this. Not after 6 years. Not in front of these people. Not after Victor's perfect performance. She should stand up. Apologize. Say she made a mistake. But then something strange happened. She looked out at the audience, and her eyes found Mrs. Winterbourne. The elderly woman was watching her with such kindness, such hope, such trust. She'd asked for help, and Isabella had said yes. Next to Mrs. Winterbourne sat a young girl, maybe 10 years old, looking bored in a fancy dress that probably itched. The girl was picking at her napkin, clearly dragged to this adult event against her will. And suddenly Isabella wasn't playing for the wealthy donors or the society people or Victor Ashford. She was playing for that bored little girl who might not know yet that music could be magic. She was playing for Mrs. Winterbourne, who took a chance on a scared waitress. She was playing for Linda, who believed in her. She was playing for her younger self, the girl who once dreamed of moments like this. Isabella closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about what piece to play. Something safe, something easy. Maybe a simple Mozart sonata that she could get through without mistakes. No. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. She was going to play something that meant something. She would play Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, the piece she'd performed for her conservatory audition, the day everything seemed possible. The piece her father had loved, had asked her to play over and over again during those last few months before the accident. It was a risk. The piece was technically challenging, full of delicate passages that required perfect control. After 6 years without practice, she might mess up. She probably would mess up, but it was honest. And right now, honesty felt more important than perfection. Her hands hovered over the keys for one more heartbeat. Somewhere in the audience, she heard Victor laugh quietly, probably thinking she was too scared to begin. Let him laugh. Isabella's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes began to fall into the silent ballroom like raindrops on a still pond. Soft, gentle, searching. The nocturne began with a simple, haunting melody. Just a few notes, repeated and varied, like a question being asked again and again. Her right hand carried the melody while her left hand provided a steady, rolling accompaniment. The muscle memory was there, buried, but not forgotten. Her fingers remembered the patterns, the stretches, the movements. It felt like meeting an old friend after years apart. Awkward at first, then suddenly familiar. But something was different from how she used to play. 6 years ago, she'd played this piece perfectly. Every note exactly as written, every dynamic precisely marked. She'd been trying to prove she belonged at the conservatory, trying to show she was good enough. Now she had nothing to prove, nothing to lose. She was just a waitress playing a piano in a room full of strangers. And maybe that's what set her free. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She was thinking about her father, who used to sit in their tiny living room and close his eyes when she played, a smile on his tired face. She was thinking about her mother, paralyzed now but still asking Isabella to hum melodies for her. She was thinking about Rico and Maya, growing up in a world where dreams had to bend to reality. She was thinking about sacrifice and loss and love and hope and all the complicated, beautiful, painful things that make us human, and all of that poured into the music. The nocturne swelled, the melody climbing higher, becoming more insistent. Her hands moved across the keys, no longer shaking, no longer uncertain. The piano responded to her touch, its voice filling the ballroom with something that hadn't been there during Victor's performance. Soul raw, honest, vulnerable soul. Isabella didn't notice that the murmuring had stopped. She didn't see the guests leaning forward in their seats. She didn't notice Victor's smirk fading, replaced by something closer to shock. She was lost in the music, and the music was lost in her, and for these few precious minutes, nothing else existed. Isabella's world had narrowed to just her and the piano. The ballroom, the people, even her own nervousness had faded away. There was only the music and the feeling it carried. The middle section of the nocturne came now, more complex, more demanding. Her left hand crossed over her right, fingers stretching to reach notes that felt impossibly far apart. This was the part that had taken her months to learn when she was 16, the part she'd practiced until her fingers ached. But now those same fingers found their way automatically. They remembered. The body doesn't forget, even when the mind tries to. She played through a particularly difficult passage, one that required her right hand to play a melody while simultaneously adding intricate ornamental notes. It was like having a conversation with yourself, two voices speaking at once but somehow making perfect sense together. Her eyes were still closed. She couldn't have opened them if she tried. Opening them would mean seeing the audience, remembering where she was, remembering that she was supposed to be afraid. Instead, she saw her father. Clear as day, sitting in their old apartment, his work clothes still dusty from the construction site. He'd been so tired in those days, working double shifts to keep the family afloat. But when Isabella played, his face would light up. Mi tesoro, he'd call her. My treasure. A tear slipped down her cheek, but her hands never faltered. The music, built toward its emotional peak, the moment where everything comes together. This was where Chopin showed his genius, taking that simple opening melody and transforming it, adding layers of meaning, making it say things that words never could. Isabella's whole body moved with the music now. Not dramatically, not for show, but because the music demanded it. She swayed slightly, leaning into the harder passages, pulling back during the soft ones. Her face showed everything she was feeling. Pain, loss, love, hope. In the audience, something extraordinary was happening. The young girl who'd been bored earlier was sitting perfectly still now, her eyes wide. She'd forgotten about her itchy dress, forgotten she'd rather be home playing video games. She was mesmerized. Mrs. Winterbourne had tears running down her carefully powdered cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away. A businessman in his 60s, who'd come tonight only because his wife insisted, found his throat tight with emotion. He couldn't remember the last time music had made him feel anything. Victor sat rigid in his chair, his expression unreadable. His girlfriend Veronica had stopped smiling, sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite understanding what. Even the servers had stopped working. Linda stood with her hands clasped to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Chen watched with her mouth slightly open, all her stern professionalism temporarily forgotten. Tommy, who'd called Victor's, playing empty earlier, was nodding slowly, as if someone had just proven a point he'd been trying to make. The music began its descent now, moving toward resolution. The melody came back to its original form, simpler now, quieter, like someone who's been on a long journey and finally come home. Isabella's fingers played softer and softer. The notes became gentler, more delicate. This was the hardest part technically. Playing loudly was easy. Playing so softly that each note barely whispered while still maintaining clarity, still making each one count. That required absolute control. She thought about her siblings, probably at home right now doing homework. Rico studying for his math test. Maya working on some art project, her colored pencils spread across the kitchen table. They didn't know their big sister was playing piano in a mansion for wealthy people. They thought she was just serving food, making money to pay next month's rent. What would her father think if he could see her now? Would he be proud? Would he understand why she'd given up music to take care of the family? You didn't give up music, mija, she could almost hear him saying. Music is in your soul. It's not about where you play or who hears it. It's about what you feel. The nocturne was ending now. The final notes approached, each one precious because they were running out. Isabella played them with tender care, like saying goodbye to someone you love. The last chord came. She held it, letting it ring through the ballroom, letting it fade naturally until it dissolved into silence. Only then did she lift her hands from the keys. Only then did she open her eyes. The silence that followed was complete. No one moved. No one breathed. For 3 full seconds, the ballroom existed in a state of suspended animation. Isabella blinked, reality crashing back. What had she done? Had she played badly? Had she embarrassed herself? Why was everyone so quiet? Then she saw Mrs. Winterbourne's face, wet with tears, and the elderly woman was smiling the most beautiful, genuine smile Isabella had ever seen. And then the room exploded. The applause was deafening. Not polite, not formal, but genuine and overwhelming. People were standing up, some of them so quickly they knocked over their chairs. They were clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. "Bravo!" someone shouted. Then others joined in. "Bravo! Bravo!" Isabella sat frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. People didn't react like this to a waitress playing piano. This kind of response was for real musicians, for professionals, for people like Victor Ashford. But the applause kept coming, rolling over her in waves. The young girl who'd been bored was jumping up and down, clapping over her head. The businessman was on his feet, applauding with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Winterbourne was standing, and then the entire table around her rose as well. One by one, every person in the ballroom stood up. It became a standing ovation, and it showed no signs of stopping. Isabella's hands were shaking again, but for different reasons now. Her face was wet with tears she didn't remember crying. She tried to stand, her legs unsteady, not sure what she was supposed to do. Should she bow? Should she run? Should she wake up from this impossible dream? She managed to stand and gave an awkward, unpracticed bow, nothing like Victor's smooth, professional gesture. But the audience loved it. The applause somehow got even louder. Linda was crying openly now, clapping so hard her hands were red. Mrs. Chen had a hand over her mouth, looking shocked in the best possible way. The other servers were applauding too, grinning widely, and then Isabella's eyes found Victor. He was standing, like everyone else. But he wasn't clapping. He stood perfectly still, his face pale, his expression completely transformed from the smirking amusement he'd shown before. He looked stunned, shaken, like someone had just challenged everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, about what really mattered when someone sat down at a piano. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Isabella saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not dismissal, recognition, and maybe, just maybe, shame. Mrs. Winterbourne was pushing through the crowd, heading straight for Isabella. The elderly woman reached her and grabbed both her hands, squeezing them tightly. "My dear girl," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" Isabella's voice came out small and uncertain. I studied at Riverside Conservatory, ma'am, just for 1 semester." "1 semester?" Mrs. Winterbourne looked shocked. "But you play like someone who's been performing for years." "That was." She struggled to find words. "That was real music, dear. Music with a soul." Other guests were crowding around now, wanting to congratulate her, to shake her hand, to know her story. "Who's your teacher? Where do you perform? Do you have recordings? What other pieces can you play?" Isabella felt overwhelmed, drowning in attention she'd never expected and wasn't prepared for. Her heart was racing. Her mouth was dry. This was too much, too fast. And then, through the crowd, Victor Ashford began walking toward her. The sea of people parted for him automatically, the way crowds always did for important people. He walked, slowly, his expression serious, his usual confidence replaced with something more complicated. Isabella's breath caught. Was he angry? Was he about to say something cruel to bring her back down to earth, to remind her that she was just a waitress who got lucky? She braced herself for the worst. Victor stopped in front of her, and for a long moment, he just looked at her. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time since he'd arrived. Then he did something that shocked everyone, especially Isabella. He extended his hand. Not in the dismissive way he had earlier. Not in the automatic social gesture of someone going through motions, but genuinely with respect. Isabella stared at Victor's extended hand, not quite believing what she was seeing. The entire ballroom had gone quiet again, everyone watching this moment unfold. "I apologize," Victor said. and his voice was different from before. Quieter. Humbler. For my earlier behavior. It was inexcusable. Isabella hesitantly took his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, and he shook her hand once properly, before letting go. "You have a rare gift," he continued, and now his voice carried across the silent room. "I played the notes perfectly tonight. I know I did. But you?" He paused, seeming to struggle with what came next. "You made them live. You gave them meaning. That's something He stopped again, and Isabella saw something vulnerable flash across his face. "That's something I've forgotten how to do." The confession hung in the air, raw and honest. Veronica appeared at Victor's elbow, looking confused and slightly annoyed. "Victor, what are you doing?" He ignored her, keeping his attention on Isabella. "How long did you study?" "Just 1 semester at Riverside," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to leave." "Had to leave?" Mrs. Winterbourne asked. "But why, dear?" "With talent like yours?" Isabella's throat tightened. She didn't want to cry again. Not here, not in front of all these people. But the question brought everything back. The phone call. The hospital. Her mother's broken body in that bed. Rico's terrified face. Maya crying and not understanding why Daddy wasn't coming home. "My parents were in an accident," she said finally, the words coming out rough. "My father died. My mother was paralyzed. I have 2 younger siblings. Someone had to take care of them." The silence that followed was different now, heavy with understanding. "So you gave up your dreams," Mrs. Winterbourne said softly, "to take care of your family." "It wasn't really a choice," Isabella said. "It was just what needed to happen." An older woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice gentle. "How old were you, dear?" 17. Gasps rippled through the audience. 17. Still basically a child herself, taking on the responsibility of an entire family. "And you've been working since then?" Mrs. Winterbourne asked. "Yes, ma'am. 3 jobs usually, sometimes 4 if I can manage it. The diner, the coffee shop, catering events like this one. Whatever pays. When do you practice?" Victor asked suddenly. The question seemed to burst out of him. Isabella looked at him, confused. "I haven't touched a piano in 6 years." "Not until tonight." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Victor's eyes widened. "You haven't practiced in 6 years?" He repeated as if he couldn't quite believe it. "And you just played like that?" "I play in my head sometimes," Isabella said, "while I'm washing dishes or waiting on tables. I imagine the pieces, imagine my fingers on the keys. But actual practicing? No, there's no time, and I can't afford a piano or even a keyboard." Victor looked like she'd just told him something impossible. He'd been practicing since he was 3 years old. Hours every day, private instructors, the best conservatories, every advantage money could buy. And this waitress, who hadn't touched a piano in 6 years, had just played with more heart and soul than he'd shown in his last 10 performances combined. "You played from memory?" someone asked. "After 6 years?" "Music doesn't leave you," Isabella said simply. "Not if you really love it. It stays inside waiting." The young girl who'd been bored earlier pushed through the crowd, her mother following behind. She looked up at Isabella with wide, awestruck eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," the girl said. "I take piano lessons, but they're boring. My teacher just makes me play scales. But when you played, it was like magic." Isabella knelt down to the girl's level, smiling despite her tears. "What's your name?" "Lily." "Well, Lily, the scales are important. They're like learning the alphabet before you can write stories. But your teacher should also let you play pieces you love. Music isn't just about getting everything perfect. It's about feeling something and sharing it. Will you teach me?" Lily asked hopefully. Lily's mother laughed, but Isabella could see tears in her eyes too. "Sweetheart, I'm sure Ms. Rodriguez is very busy." "I am pretty busy," Isabella agreed gently. "But I'll tell you a secret. You don't need someone like me to teach you how to feel music. You already know how. You just have to be brave enough to let it out." Mrs. Winterbourne was watching this exchange with a thoughtful expression. Suddenly, she clapped her hands together, getting everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've witnessed something truly special tonight. Not just a performance, but a reminder of what music is really about." She turned to Isabella. "My dear, would you be willing to share your contact information? I know several people here tonight who would very much like to speak with you." Isabella felt overwhelmed again. Yes, of course, but I'm not sure what." "I'd like to speak with you," interrupted a distinguished-looking man Isabella recognized as Dr. Harrison Chen, the director of Riverside Conservatory. She'd seen his picture on the website when she was applying all those years ago. "About finishing your degree?" Isabella's heart stopped. "I'm sorry, what?" "You left after one semester, correct? That means you still have credits on file. I'd like to discuss getting you back into the program." "I can't afford," Isabella started. "Full scholarship," Dr. Chen interrupted, "plus a stipend for living expenses. We have emergency funding for exceptional cases, and this certainly qualifies. But my family, we'll work around your schedule," he continued, "part-time enrollment if necessary. The point is, talent like yours shouldn't be wasted serving champagne. No offense to the noble profession of service," he added quickly, nodding to the other servers. Isabella felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. "I'll fund it," a voice said. A wealthy-looking woman stepped forward. "Dr. Chen, I'll cover the full scholarship and whatever stipend is needed. Plus," she turned to Isabella, "I'll pay for a quality instrument for you to practice on. Nothing fancy, but something reliable." "I'll contribute too," another donor said. "And I," said a third. Suddenly, multiple people were volunteering money, offering support, wanting to be part of Isabella's story. Victor watched all of this with a strange expression on his face. Finally, he spoke up again. "I'd like to help too," he said. "Not with money. These generous people clearly have that covered. But I perform at charity events all over the country. I have connections, platforms, influence." He looked directly at Isabella. "I could introduce you to people, help you get performance opportunities, if you're interested." Veronica tugged on his arm, hissing, "Victor, what are you doing? She's competition." "She's not competition," Victor said, still looking at Isabella. "She's a reminder of what I should be striving for." He turned to his girlfriend, and his voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe you should get a ride home with the Hendersons." "I think I need to stay and talk with some people." Veronica's mouth dropped open. But Victor had already turned back to Isabella. Mrs. Winterbourne was beaming now, tears still on her cheeks but her smile radiant. "Well then, it seems, my dear, that your life is about to change quite dramatically." Isabella looked around at all these faces, all these strangers who moments ago had been just wealthy people at a fancy party. Now they were looking at her with kindness, with excitement, with genuine desire to help. Linda pushed through the crowd and grabbed Isabella's hand, squeezing it tightly. She didn't say anything, just smiled with pride and joy. Isabella's own tears came again, but these were different. Not sad tears, not overwhelmed tears, something else entirely. Hope. After 6 long years of surviving, of sacrificing, of putting everyone else first and her dreams last, hope was blooming in her chest like a flower that had been waiting underground through a harsh winter. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Mrs. Winterbourne said warmly. "Say yes to finishing your education. Say yes to these opportunities. Say yes to sharing your extraordinary gift with the world." Isabella looked at the piano still sitting there with its lid open, the keys gleaming under the lights. Just hours ago it had seemed like a relic from someone else's life, a reminder of everything she'd lost. Now it looked like a door opening to a future she'd stopped letting herself imagine. She took a deep breath and felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked up tight, sealed away to protect herself from hurt. It was breaking open now, flooding her with feeling that was terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, I'll say yes." The ballroom erupted in applause again, but this time Isabella barely heard it. She was looking at that piano, at those keys, thinking about her father, about her mother, about Rico and Maya. She'd given up music for them, but maybe she didn't have to anymore. Maybe there was a way to take care of them and still follow her dreams. Maybe sacrifice didn't have to mean giving up everything forever. Maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Isabella. People kept approaching her, introducing themselves, exchanging contact information, sharing stories about how her performance had moved them. Business cards piled up in her hands until Linda appeared with a small purse to hold them all. Victor stayed nearby, not hovering but present, occasionally stepping in when Isabella looked overwhelmed. It was strange seeing him like this, so different from the arrogant performer who'd arrived hours earlier. He'd shed that glossy, untouchable persona, and what remained seemed more real, more human. During a brief quiet moment, he approached her again. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Isabella nodded and they stepped away from the crowd, finding a spot near one of the large windows overlooking the estate gardens. "I need to explain something," Victor said, staring out at the dark landscape. "When I heard you play tonight, it did something to me. Something uncomfortable." He turned to face her. "I've been playing piano since I was 3 years old. My parents were both musicians. They pushed me hard, entered me in competitions, got me the best teachers, made sure I had every possible advantage." "That sounds amazing," Isabella said. It was amazing. And terrible. And lonely. Victor ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect style. "By the time I was 12, piano wasn't about music anymore. It was about winning. About being the best. About building a career. I stopped playing for joy and started playing for applause." "But you're so successful," Isabella pointed out. "I'm technically successful," he corrected. "I play the notes perfectly. Critics praise my precision. I fill concert halls. But tonight, watching you play, seeing how you connected with that music, how it connected with the audience." He shook his head. "I realized I haven't felt that connection in years." "Maybe ever. You can get it back," Isabella said. "It's not too late. Maybe, I don't know." He looked at her intently. "But watching you tonight, seeing what real passion looks like, what it sounds like when someone plays with their whole heart, that changed something in me. I don't know what I'm going to do with that feeling yet. But I needed you to know. You didn't just play beautifully tonight. You taught me something I should have learned years ago." Isabella didn't know what to say. This famous pianist, who could have dismissed her, ignored her, or maintained his superior attitude, was being genuinely vulnerable. "Thank you," she said finally, "for being honest. And for apologizing earlier. That meant a lot. It was the least I could do." He smiled. A real smile this time, not the practiced one. "I meant what I said about helping with connections. I have a friend who books performers for hotel lobbies and restaurant openings. Nothing huge, but good experience and decent pay. If you're interested, I'll send you her information." "I'd appreciate that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Victor spoke again. "Can I ask you something? How did you do it? Play like that after 6 years of not practicing?" Isabella thought about it. "I think, when you really love something, it becomes part of you. Not just in your hands or your technique, but deeper, in your soul, I guess. I couldn't practice, but I never stopped hearing music. Every sad moment, every happy moment, every struggle, every small victory, I heard it all as melodies. So when I finally got to play again, all of that came out. Music from life instead of life from music," Victor said quietly. "I've been doing it backward." Before Isabella could respond, Mrs. Winterbourne appeared, slightly out of breath. "There you are!" "Isabella, dear, I have someone else who wants to meet you. Caroline West from the Tribune. She writes the arts and culture column, and she's very interested in your story." The rest of the evening continued like that. Introductions, conversations, opportunities emerging from every direction. It was exciting and exhausting and completely surreal. Dr. Chen gave her his direct phone number and email, making her promise to contact him within the week to discuss re-enrollment. The wealthy woman who'd offered to fund her scholarship, Patricia Williamson, insisted on exchanging numbers right away. "I mean what I said about the piano. We'll get you a proper instrument within the month." Even Lily's mother approached with an offer. "I know you're going to be very busy, but if you ever have time, Lily would love just one lesson. Even just an hour. I'll pay whatever your rate is." "I don't have a rate," Isabella said, overwhelmed. "I'm not a teacher." "Well, you should be," Lily's mother said warmly. "You have a gift for explaining things. I saw how you talked to Lily, that's rare." By 10 o'clock, Isabella was emotionally drained, but somehow also energized. It was like she'd been living in black and white for 6 years, and suddenly the world had burst into color. Linda found her near the coat check. "The catering crew is packing up. Mrs. Chen says you're free to go whenever you want. Special circumstances and all." She grinned. "Also, you're officially the most famous person in our agency now. This story is going to be legend." Isabella laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I still can't believe any of this is real." "Believe it, honey. You earned this." Linda pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you. And I'm so glad I told Mrs. Winterbourne about you." "Thank you," Isabella whispered, "for believing in me. Always." Isabella changed back into her regular clothes, the server's uniform feeling strange now, like a costume from someone else's life. She carefully placed all the business cards and contact information in her backpack, treating them like precious artifacts. As she was leaving through the service entrance, she nearly bumped into Victor, who was also heading out. "Leaving?" he asked. "Yeah, it's been quite a night." "That's an understatement," he smiled. "Can I give you a ride?" "Where do you live?" "Oh no, that's okay. The bus runs until midnight, and Isabella." He said her name gently but firmly. "You just changed my entire perspective on music and probably my whole career. The least I can do is give you a ride home. Please?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Thank you." His car was exactly what you'd expect: expensive, sleek, probably cost more than Isabella would make in 5 years. But he opened the door for her like a gentleman and didn't make a big deal about the difference between his world and hers. As they drove through the quiet streets, Victor asked about her family. She told him about Rico, who wanted to be an engineer, about Maya, who loved to draw, about her mother, who'd shown incredible strength through recovery and adaptation. "They're why I do everything," Isabella said. "Every job, every sacrifice. It's all for them. And now you can do something for yourself too," Victor pointed out, "without abandoning them. That's not selfish, Isabella. That's balance." When they reached her apartment building, a modest complex in a working-class neighborhood, Victor didn't make any comments about the area. He simply wished her good night and promised to send that contact information he'd mentioned. "Victor," Isabella said before getting out, "that thing you said about losing the connection to music? I think you can find it again. You just have to remember why you started playing in the first place." He was quiet for a moment. "I honestly can't remember anymore. It's been so long since it was about anything but achievement. Then maybe you need to discover a new reason, not the one your parents gave you or the one critics expect. Your own reason." Victor looked at her with something like wonder. "How did you get so wise at 24? "Hard living," she said with a slight smile. "It's a tough teacher, but very effective." After he drove away, Isabella stood outside her apartment building for a moment, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rico. "How was the fancy party?" "We ate all the leftover pizza." "Sorry, not sorry." She smiled and texted back. "The party was good. Really good. I'll tell you all about it tomorrow. Love you." Inside the apartment, her mother was still awake, reading in her wheelchair by the window. She looked up when Isabella entered. "You're home late. Did they make you work extra?" "No, Mama, something else happened." Isabella knelt beside her mother's chair and took her hand. Something wonderful and impossible and maybe life-changing. Her mother studied her face, seeing something there that made her smile. "Tell me everything," so Isabella did. She told her about the emergency, about agreeing to play, about the performance and the reaction and all the opportunities that followed. Her mother listened, tears streaming down her face, squeezing Isabella's hand tighter and tighter. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered when Isabella finished. "He always knew you were special. He always said your music had something that couldn't be taught." "I played the nocturne," Isabella said softly. "The one he loved. I know, Mija. I felt him there with you. I'm sure of it." They sat together in the quiet apartment, holding hands, both crying and smiling at the same time. Outside, the city continued its endless noise, but in that small room, there was peace and hope and the beginning of something new. Isabella thought about the piano waiting at Riverside Conservatory, about the lessons she might teach, about the performances she might give, about the future that had suddenly opened up like a flower blooming in fast motion. But mostly, she thought about the feeling of those keys under her fingers, the sound of that beautiful Steinway, the connection she'd felt with the music and the audience. That feeling of coming home to a part of herself she'd locked away, Mig. 3 months later, Isabella stood backstage at the Riverside Conservatory's recital hall, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that Patricia Williamson had helped her pick out. Her hands were shaking, but it was a different kind of nervousness than that night at the Winterbourne mansion. Then she'd been terrified. Now she was just excited. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change. Dr. Chen had been true to his word, getting her re-enrolled with a full scholarship plus a stipend that allowed her to cut back to just 1 job instead of 3. She'd kept her position at the diner because she genuinely liked the people there, and they'd been flexible about her schedule. Patricia Williamson had delivered on her promise too. A beautiful upright piano now sat in their apartment's small living room. It wasn't a Steinway grand, but it was real with a good tone and responsive keys. Maya had been using it too, showing surprising talent of her own. Rico pretended he wasn't interested, but Isabella had caught him playing simple melodies late at night when he thought no one was listening. The Tribune article had run 2 weeks after the gala, and suddenly Isabella's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Small venues wanting her to play, students wanting lessons, churches, restaurants, retirement homes all interested in booking her. Victor had been instrumental too, keeping his promise about connections. He'd introduced her to booking agents, other musicians, and even invited her to play a small piece during his intermission at a downtown concert. That performance had led to more opportunities, but the biggest surprise had been Victor himself. After that night at the mansion, he'd started coming to her practice sessions at the conservatory, just sitting and listening. They'd become unlikely friends, two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in music. He'd started playing differently too. Less focused on technical perfection, more interested in emotional expression. His recent performances had gotten reviews describing him as more vulnerable and emotionally resonant. Some critics preferred his old style, but others praised his evolution. Turns out, he'd told Isabella over coffee one afternoon, I needed someone to remind me why I started playing in the first place. Or maybe to help me find a new reason to play. Either way, thank you. Now, standing backstage at her first official conservatory recital since returning to school, Isabella could hear the audience filing in. The hall seated about 200 people. It wasn't huge by professional standards, but for a student recital it was significant. She peeked through the curtain and her heart swelled. The front row was packed with familiar faces. Her mother in her wheelchair, beaming with pride. Rico and Maya on either side of her, dressed in their best clothes. Linda from the catering company had come, along with several other servers from that night. Mrs. Chen was there too. Looking oddly emotional, Mrs. Winterbourne sat in the third row, surrounded by several donors from the gala who'd helped fund Isabella's return to school. Patricia,